Picture 4 men crammed into a single jeep, not because it was comfortable, but because it was enough. They built the whole idea around one vehicle that could do the work of a small team if it moved fast and hit the right things first. That meant the jeep carried far more than the normal kit. It was loaded with extra guns, extra ammunition, extra fuel, and whatever destructive stores could be squeezed in without making it completely unusable. But the plan did not depend on holding ground or trading fire for long. It depended on getting inside the perimeter, moving through it at speed, and treating the airfield as like a checklist of priorities. Aircraft came first, always. Not because people did not matter, but because aircraft were the point of the place. After that came fuel dumps, because fuel was what kept aircraft and vehicles alive. Ammunition stores were still a target, but often as a follow-on. Something to light up when the biggest, easiest damage had already been done. Control points were not an abstract concept. They meant practical things like radios, gate posts, and airfield lighting. The pieces that let defenders coordinate and respond. Accounts of these raids describe them as sudden, vehicle-led overruns. Often it was not one jeep at all, but several moving in a column, each one doing a specific job within the rush. Still, and a single jeep could be treated as its own little strike unit if it carried the right mix of people and gear. Many reports mention crews of 3 or 4 per jeep. The roles were simple, because they had to be. One man drove, one or more handled the guns, someone managed ammunition and also navigated on the approach, because there was no room for wasted movement. A 4th man, when there was one, tended to the incendiary and demolition stores and kept track of what was meant for which target. The jeep itself was expected to live with overload as a normal condition, not an accident. To make the weight work at all, crews stripped off anything they could justify removing. Standard fittings disappeared. Windscreens were often taken off so the guns had a clear arc and the driver did not have a fragile sheet of glass in front of him. Some jeeps carried an armoured glass panel as a crude shield, but even that came with trade-offs. Because any protection could interfere with gun movement and visibility, the weapon layout usually revolved around the Vickers K, a gun originally designed for flexible aircraft mounting. It fit the role because it could put out a high volume of fire from a moving platform, and it could be adapted when proper mounts were not available. The mounts were rarely elegant. They were built around what could be found or fabricated, pedestals, posts, brackets, and though whatever metal could be cut and drilled in a workshop that was never set up for mass production. Crews often fitted guns in pairs to increase the amount of firearms a pass. Some vehicles were loaded with as many as 5 machine guns, though the exact arrangement depended on the crew, the parts on hand, and what the local workshop could actually build. A common setup put twin guns forward. Another pair might face rearward to keep something covering the withdrawal. That sometimes a single gun was positioned to protect the driver's sector. Photographs show examples with 3 Vickers K, which became a kind of practical midpoint between ambition and what the chassis could tolerate. All that firepower came with a cost. The recoil loads went into thin bodywork and mounts that were never designed for sustained firing. Workshops tried to solve that by adding gussets, strap brackets and backing plates. Holes were laid out with chalk marks drilled in place, and sometimes finished by hand when power tools were unavailable or unreliable. Soft panel metal stripped threads easily, so repairs often meant putting reinforcement plates behind the mounting points, especially inside boxed sections where access was awkward and work had to be done by feel. Nothing about the hardware was perfectly standardized. Fasteners came from mixed British and American stores, and whatever fit often got used. The tooling depended on jigs made for small runs rather than any factory line. A welded fixture might set a pedestal height the same way each time, but even then, clamp marks and quick weld beads could still be seen under later paint. Paint was usually applied quickly, more to kill glare and protect bare metal than to look tidy. Stenciling was inconsistent from vehicle to vehicle, and serial markings could vanish under hurried field repainting. Ammunition loadouts pushed the limits as much as the weapons did. Magazines took up space that would normally be reserved for rations or personal kit. Webbing pouches ended up strapped to almost every rail. Loose magazines were a problem because travel vibration could dent or damage feed lips, which then turned into stoppages when it mattered. Crews wrapped magazines in canvas to reduce rattle and protect the edges. Tracer was used to help place fire, especially when the targets were dark shapes under bad light. Incendiary effect was the goal against parked aircraft, where fires could spread and where a brief pass could still do lasting damage. Belts were less common for Vickers K use, so reload rhythm became part of how the crew moved. The timing of reloads and magazine changes forced a kind of choreography inside a cramped vehicle, where each man had to know when to pass, when to clear, and when to stay out of the way. Her fuel carriage defined the whole look of the overloaded Jeep. Jerry cans were stacked along the flanks and across the rear because the raids needed long approach legs across desert to ground. These were not short hops with easy resupply, they were planned to be self-contained. That much fuel brought obvious risk. Heat and vibration increased spillage. Caps were sometimes safety wired when the threads looked worn or the sealing was doubtful, if a can leaked, that it might be marked and moved away from the others because clustered fuel was a hazard. Fumes near a hot exhaust were another problem, so spacing and placement became a discipline, not a preference. Rags were kept on hand for wipe downs, both for safety and to stop fuel from soaking into straps and webbing. Inside that packed space, ammunition and fuel competed for the same deck area. Crews managed it with load plans, and sometimes written on pocket cards that listed firing order and target priority. The load was not just piled in randomly. Weight distribution mattered, and it was adjusted by trial. Forward gun clusters increased front axle load. Steering effort climbed, especially in low-speed turns where the driver had to fight the weight and the front end wanted to plough. Suspension travel shrank under stacked stores. Shock absorbers could overheat on long corrugated tracks. The leaf springs sometimes cracked around centre bolts. Field repairs used spare leaves and clamps, the kind of solution that worked well enough to get a vehicle back to a hideout. Tyres were another constant weakness. Overloading and sharp debris caused failures. Spare wheels were not optional if the crew wanted independent movement. Inner tubes were patched with vulcanizing kits, and even the hand pumps suffered, with handles wearing out from dust. And air filters clogged quickly on off-road approaches. Crews cleaned oil bath units in whatever light they had, sometimes by candle, because maintenance had to happen even when the schedule was tight. Oil changes were based on estimated mileage, not odometer readings, because conditions made the numbers unreliable. Engines ran rich under repeated short bursts of hard driving. Spark plugs fouled with carbon. Spare plugs lived in cloth rolls along with the toolkit, which typically included feeler gauges and spanners for quick adjustments. Improvised mounts demanded constant attention. Bolts needed retorque because vibration never stopped working them loose. Painted fasteners hid witness marks, so crews scribed their own lines to see movement. Missing washers were replaced with strips cut from metal strap, but those cuts left burrs that tore at gloves. Gloves were rationed and often missing, so hands ended up getting cleaned with fuel and grit, which was harsh but practical. Gun performance depended on cooling, and cooling depended on airflow. Sustained firing during a runway run could overheat barrels. Overheat created a risk of cook-offs in a hot chamber, so drills often limited burst length to protect parts and keep the guns running. Assistant gunners counted bursts by seconds. Stopwatches were not always available, so counting stayed manual, and miscounts could leave a gun empty at the worst moment. As reload calls were worked out within each crew, and because engine noise drowned out voices, signals were sometimes reduced to taps and simple gestures. Night movement avoided headlights. Navigation relied on compass work and practiced bearings, with route notes copied from larger patrol logs when possible. Some raids used rehearsals before execution, and there are records of a dress rehearsal connected to Sidi Haineish. Hideout positions were chosen carefully, including areas near Bir el Qusayr, that approach distance is often described as roughly 50 miles, though exact figures vary by account. Entry into the airfield depended on speed and close fire. Jeep columns moved in a planned formation, and a green flare could signal the forward rush. Runway lights were observed on approach, and the sudden appearance of a landing aircraft could force immediate commitment because hesitation would only waste the one advantage the plan had. And the objective stayed focused on aircraft destruction on the ground. Notes from trials suggest tracer helped gunners place fire on silhouettes. Accounts list aircraft types like Ju-52 transports, Ju-87 aircraft, and Bf-109 fighters, though the exact mix depended on the airfield and the day. Numbers destroyed vary between accounts, and the commonly repeated figure is 37 aircraft. Casualty summaries are often thin, and the same sources note 3 jeeps lost in that raid and 1 man killed during the airfield action. Counterfire included machine guns and anti-aircraft fire, and a disabled jeep could become a dangerous blockage in the lanes. Crews trained themselves to drive around immobilized vehicles rather than stop and get caught. Escape planning assumed defenders would organize quickly once the alarm spread, but withdrawal routes were set before crossing the perimeter because there was no time to debate direction under fire. Groups separated to reduce vulnerability to a single ambush, and rendezvous points were picked using terrain references that could be recognized at night. Final extraction depended on fuel reserves staying intact. Overusing fuel during the attack shortened the safe distance on the way out. Drivers tried to avoid unnecessary braking to save tyres and reduce mechanical strain. But braking problems still showed up. Brake fade happened on overloaded runs and downhill movement. Brake fluid could boil after prolonged hard stops. Some crews adjusted brake shoes using field spanners. Brake drums filled with sand, reducing friction. Compressed air was rarely available, so cleaning meant cloth and brushwork between the linings. Clutch plates were under repeated rapid launches, and a burnt smell was the warning sign of slipping under load. Drivers sometimes compensated with higher gear starts, but that raised the risk of stalling when the engine was already stressed. Stall recovery drills were practiced away from objectives, so the response became automatic. Small mechanical tweaks kept the Jeep usable. A hand throttle helped hold steady idle when the engine wanted to falter. Idle adjustments were done with screwdriver tips. Carburetor jets clogged with fine dust. Fuel strainers were rinsed in cold water, which reduced drinking reserves. Water cans were strapped separately from fuel, and mislabeling could lead to dangerous swaps during night servicing. Crews painted caps to identify cans quickly. Paint chipped, exposing bare metal, and rust accelerated where straps rubbed constantly. Oil and dust formed an abrasive paste on rails that wore through webbing and canvas loops. Resupply was not smooth. Replacement webbing arrived irregularly through quartermaster channels. Some Vickers K guns were unofficially sourced, with notes describing recovery of aircraft weapons from scrapyards. That kind of sourcing created problems for accounting. Stores ledgers did not always match issue voucher numbers, and clerks struggled to reconcile missing serial entries. Unit workshops often kept weapons under local responsibility because formal systems moved too slowly for the pace of raids. Ammunition supply still demanded formal requests and signatures. Sometimes signatures were pooled under senior authority to speed the process, but receipts still travelled slowly between depots. Delays forced crews to conserve practice ammunition, which reduced familiarity with stoppage drills. Stoppages happened from magazine spring fatigue. Springs were stretched even though it reduced reliability. Bent feed lips were reshaped with pliers, which marred metal and left sharp edges. Those edges cut gloves and fingertips. Blood contamination could lead to corrosion inside magazines, so magazines were wiped with oily cloth after raids. Oily cloths were stored in tin boxes to reduce fire risk during transport. Movement between hideouts used dispersed spacing. It reduced dust signature and lowered collision risk, but dust could still show in moonlight. Reports sometimes mentioned favourable moon conditions, while cloud cover changed both navigation and concealment. Weather notes were entered on patrol sheets, and those sheets also recorded fuel used per leg. Fuel figures shaped later load decisions, repeated overfilling deformed cans which prevented caps sealing properly. Leaky seals were packed with improvised gasket material, but some improvised gaskets dissolved under petrol, creating debris that ended up in funnels. Funnels were made from cut tins, and cut tins left burrs that needed filing. Filing took time, and time was always short because maintenance windows were squeezed by operational tempo. As airfield raids succeeded, tempo increased. More raids meant more spares consumed. Spares came through mixed pipelines. Some parts arrived with American markings. Other items were British pattern webbing. Compatibility problems forced the use of adapters and shims. Shims were cut from scrap sheet stock and thickness varied between batches, which changed clamp pressure on gun posts. Loose posts created sight wander under vibration. Sights were often crude, sometimes no more than a simple ring reference. Crews practiced aligning tracers onto wing roots because wing roots offered a likely intersection of fuel and structure. Aircraft tyres were also targeted to immobilize planes and prevent rapid dispersal by ground crews. Ground crews sometimes fired from slit trenches, which forced gunners to shoot while moving. Moving fire reduced accuracy, but it helped keep the Jeep from becoming a stationary target. The Jeep's role was never to linger. Crews avoided stopping near aircraft clusters because stops invited concentrated fire. Drivers learned to steer by peripheral cues, using runway edges and shadows when visibility collapsed. Dust inside the perimeter could reduce sight instantly. Armoured glass shields helped against debris, but they also interfered with some arcs, which required altered elevation stops. Those stops were often welded tabs, and weld quality depended on generator availability. Poor welds cracked under recoil. Cracks were marked with grease pencil lines and watched during inspections. Repairs were scheduled when parts and time could be found, but accessibility depended on the next tasking orders. Orders moved through written signals and briefings. Briefings listed objectives and timing windows. Timing depended on enemy air routine, assessed through observation and reports. Though reports were logged and forwarded for collation. Collation produced target folders for later raids, including sketch maps and entry tracks. Sketch maps relied on landmarks rather than precise grid references, and landmarks could change with sand movement and traffic. As navigation error accumulated, fuel safety margins had to widen. Wider margins meant carrying more fuel. More fuel increased axle stress and tyre risk. These trade-offs show up in trial notes, which emphasize speed over armour. And armour fitments stayed minimal on these Jeeps. Open tops left crews exposed to blast and fragments, but removing screens and roofs reduced the silhouette and cleared weapon movement. Some earlier vehicle experiments used disguised cars modified to resemble enemy staff transport, and Jeep conversions expanded from that kind of thinking. Conversion work was handled by detachment engineers who focused on storage for fuel and equipment. Unnecessary items were removed for space, including bumpers and some body panels. Weight reduction improved acceleration under load, and acceleration mattered because it reduced time under direct fire. Planning kept time inside the runway perimeter as short as possible. Crews rehearsed turns between aircraft revetments because revetments could snag jerry cans. Snagged cans tore straps and spilled fuel. Straps were upgraded with doubled webbing, but that increased bulk at buckle points. Bulk interfered with access and seat movement. The seats were sometimes removed entirely, forcing men to sit on stowage. That changed posture and reach determined where mounts could realistically be placed. Mount placement was checked through dry traversing drills using empty guns for safety. Safety procedures existed, usually written in unit notes. They required chambers cleared before vehicle movement. Clearing required visual checks under poor light, and poor light led to occasional negligent discharges. And those incidents were handled quietly, with discipline and correction rather than show. Damaged tarps were repaired with needle kits, and those same kits were used on torn webbing. Thread supply ran short, so repairs became crude knots that slipped. Slipping knots dropped magazines onto the tracks. Dropped magazines filled with grit. Grit increased friction and spring drag. Spring drag made the top round present sluggishly. Sluggish presentation produced misfeeds during bursts. The misfeeds were handled with immediate action drills that were simplified to keep hands on mounts and maintain fire volume. Fire volume mattered because ignition against aircraft depended on hitting vulnerable areas and building heat and damage quickly. Ignition also depended on fuel vapor around transports and refuel areas. Refuel areas were treated as priority nodes and struck with tracer-guided bursts aimed at engines and tanks. Ammunition expenditure was logged after return and reconciled against issued quantities. Reconciliation often failed when gun stocks were scavenged or unofficial. That created friction with depots and siloed resupply, pushing crews to reuse damaged magazines and accept a higher stoppage risk. Workshops kept improvising. Spare magazine racks were built from angle iron cut with hacksaws. Hacksaw blades wore quickly on hard stock. Worn blades made crooked cuts that needed filing. The coarse files clogged with metal and had to be cleaned with wire brushes. Wire brushes also attacked rust spots caused by constant can abrasion. Abrasion cut through paint along strap lines. Bare metal could reflect moonlight, so crews dulled it with soot and grease, which then collected more grit and worsened abrasion. It became a continuous cycle of concealment measures causing wear, and wear forcing more concealment work. Radio equipment was sometimes carried for coordination. But radios brought their own problems. Batteries suffered in heat and lost capacity. Antennas snagged on brush during hide movement, bending mounts and cracking insulators. Cracked insulators produced intermittent transmission issues, which pushed teams back toward prearranged timing. Timing reliance increased risk when contact happened unexpectedly, such as a sentry or a patrol vehicle. The preferred response was bypass, not engagement, because engagement would alert the whole perimeter too early. Once detected, speed replaced concealment as the priority. That demanded clean throttle response, but throttle linkage loosened under vibration and caused lag. Crews tightened linkages with lock wire, and the cut ends of lock wire routinely injured fingers. First aid supplies were minimal because space was minimal. Bandage rolls competed with ammunition. Those space conflicts were settled by mission priority, which nearly always weighted toward aircraft destruction. Demolition stores varied by raid. Some crews carried extra charges, and those charges needed fuses protected from grit and moisture. Protection used tins, wax paper, and cloth wraps, but wraps tore in rough travel and exposed fuses to contamination. Contamination risked misfire during placement, and misfires were recorded in after-action notes alongside practical faults like loose mounts and magazine failures. Recommendations from these notes drove small redesign cycles, made from scrap with limited machine tools. Machine tool precision suffered in desert conditions because grit got onto slides. Crews managed grit with oil and cloth covers, but oil attracted dust and required constant wiping. Rags were already needed for engines, so shortages forced the use of torn uniform cloth. Personal kit suffered, and kit completeness still showed up in inspection parades, because paperwork did not disappear, just because operations were irregular. Reports were stamped and filed for higher review, and higher review affected later approval of stores. Approvals lagged behind what crews needed immediately, and that lag pushed them toward local improvisation. Over time, improvisation became doctrine. The armed jeep was treated as a controlled risk, managed through rehearsed handling. Entry and exit stayed the core of the method. An exit depended on tyres and fuel still being intact. Tyre survival depended on speed, route choice, and avoiding known mine risks. Mines forced detours, detours increased distance, and distance increased the need for more jerrycans. More jerrycans required stronger racks. Racks were made with simple bends and rivets. Rivets loosened under vibration and were replaced with nuts and bolts. Nuts needed locking because recoil shook everything loose. Split pins were used when available, but they were scarce, so bent pins were reused until they broke. Broken pin fragments jammed castellated slots and had to be picked out with makeshift wire tools. Wire tools snapped and created eye hazards, while eye protection was rarely issued for field fitting. People drilled and cut metal by squinting and turning their heads away, which made alignment worse and produced sloppy holes. Sloppy holes created slop in brackets, which amplified vibration and fatigue cracking, bringing the cycle back again. Fatigue cracking was watched through daily inspections written on small checklists. Those checklists covered fuel, tyres, mounts, and magazines. Completion meant signing a line, often with initials rather than full names. It was a simple way to track who packed which bundle, who tightened which bolts, and who last checked the cans. Bundles were tied with cord and wire twists. Wire cut into canvas over long travel and torn canvas exposed ammunition to sand. And sand pitted cartridges. Pitted cartridges increased extraction resistance. Extraction resistance caused torn rims. Torn rims required cleaning rods which had to be carried where they would not snag. Even small storage decisions like that were shaped by tight turns around parked aircraft lines, where anything protruding could catch and tear free. Aircraft lines created choke points under fire, so crews used runway edges when possible. Runway edges carried debris from bomb sorties, and debris punctured tyres, especially under overload. A puncture during the action forced fast abandonment decisions, and those decisions were usually spelled out in briefs: what to take first, what to leave, and what could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. Key items were compasses, maps, and radios. Weapons might be spiked if recovery was impossible, using sand, oil, and deliberately bent parts, hammers, files, and cold chisels were power, the toolkit, sir. But chisels sometimes chipped if the temper was poor. Chipped edges through fragments. Fragments were brushed aside and the vehicle moved again because stopping was not an option. After the rush, movement continued on preset bearings away from the airfield. Bearings were checked against stars when visibility allowed, which sometimes required stopping in low ground. Low ground risked bogging in soft sand, so sand mats and wheel channels were carried despite their weight. And channels made self-recovery possible, and self-recovery mattered because rescue meant exposure and detection. Detection risk rose after fires and explosions drew response vehicles. Response vehicles sometimes chased along perimeter tracks, and those tracks were known from reconnaissance recorded in short practical notes. Notes focused on landmarks like ridgelines and wadi cuts. Wadi cuts provided cover for concealment halts and engine cooling. Cooling reduced radiator boilover. Radiator caps were checked because weak springs vented early and lost coolant. Coolant loss forced refilling with limited water, which fed back into survival planning for long returns. All of it fits together into one blunt picture. The Jeep was made intentionally overloaded because overload was what allowed 4 men to operate independently for long distances, hit an airfield fast, and leave before defenders could organise properly. The method shows up again and again in raid accounts. Move in with speed, put fire where it counts, ignite what will spread, and get out while the vehicle can still roll.